Okay. Can you please use the chat box and say yes or no if you can hear us okay?
Thank you, Noel.
Thank you. Okay. So again, good morning and welcome. Thank you to all of you for attending today's Lay Legal webinar, Department of Child Safety and Domestic Violence. My name is Renee Glaze, and I'm one of the Victim Service Specialists here at ACES DV. And today we have with us Doreen Nicholas, our DV Response Manager at ACES DV. And so I turn it over to Doreen. Thank you.
Okay, so we can get started because Mary's here. We had about 91 people sign up, and there's only 14 of you showing, so there must be 30 or 40 sitting with you guys, each of you guys. It is Friday, so we understand that. And what we're going to do with this webinar is we're going to review what we do when we train in the Department of Child Safety New Caseworker Training Institute, and some of the activities that are going on to assist them in improving their response to families where one parent is experiencing domestic violence from the other or the other adult in the home. We sent you out a domestic violence practice guidelines form that we'll be referring to that's very exciting, that the Department of Child Safety put together to better respond to those cases where domestic violence is present. So I want to hear from you all why you're attending this webinar and what interest you have in DCS's response to domestic violence. We'll just wait until you use the chat box to answer that question. A couple of you are typing. Some of the survivors have been referred and have ongoing cases. Okay. Thank you, Noel. What did you say, Roxanne? I want to hear if any changes in practices has made in regards. Victims' rights advocate, want to gain experience, trying to take in. And finding this area. Okay, thank you, Heidi. Well, people are typing, so let's get comfortable with the dead air. Gain knowledge, any changes or updates in policies or practices within yes. Let's see if the safe and data model is being implemented. That's right. Some of you were at that training in Lake Havasu, huh? When we had David Mendel come out. Any trends? Okay, so one of the things I want to refer you to is one of the newest Morrison Institute reports, and you can get on Morrison Institute through the ASU website, or Morrison Institute has their own website. And they've got a report on the child welfare system that I think you'll find very interesting. And they recognize in that report that domestic violence is a large part of the child welfare cases and one of the reasons for removal. And that report too, right. So look for the Morrison Institute Child Welfare Report. I think you'll find it a very interesting read, and it's really spurring a lot of conversation in the child welfare system about improving and changing their responses. Yep, still involved. Good, Teresa. Hang in there with us. We need folks that have that extensive background. Thank you. So we've been working with DCS, formerly CPS, directly for about 15 years, providing training to new caseworkers and investigators, working to assist them with their policies, and given a lot of the challenges that the DCS system has had and a lot of the change in leadership and those kind of things, we've kind of moved forward in these efforts in fits and starts. But good advocates, we're persistent and we hang in there, right? When we started, we did a full 2 days worth of domestic violence training in the New Caseworker Training Institute. And it was co-facilitated by a trainer from the coalition and by one of the DCS supervisors. With the changes and challenges, we've been trimmed back to a 3.5-hour block of time to train on domestic violence. So what I'm going to share with you is what we expose the new caseworkers to, but we've been able to add, after their initial New Caseworker Training Institute, we've been able to add a segment in the academy, the DCS Academy, where within a year of their initial hire and training, we do a more in-depth look at case planning with perpetrator parents, which has really been a missing piece in domestic violence cases. As most of you know, much of the responsibility has been put on the victim parent to, quote unquote, make changes and keep the children safe without really engaging or actively engaging the perpetrator parents, the person who's actually making the environment unsafe. So that's the tack that we come at it from, is really addressing the source of the danger, the violence in the home, and better supporting victim parents. One of the things that we've found out is that many times both parents in the family will have identical case plans, which is not very helpful for a lot of victims. So when we do this training and we talk about it with this title, Dynamics of Domestic Violence, so make sure they understand the basics of domestic violence, safety issues in the family that's experiencing domestic violence, and safety for the caseworkers. So, our objective in this training is, one, to recognize the overlap of child abuse and domestic violence, because there's a very large overlap, to increase understanding on the impact of domestic violence on adult and child victims, and for them to really understand what supportive interventions look like and sound like, and for them to have access to local and statewide resources. So we always give them the most current services list for the domestic and sexual violence programs around the state, and we always make sure they have the legal advocacy hotline brochures at their disposal, plus a variety of shoe cards and other handouts. So we start with the link for the webinar. It should be on ClickMeetings website. Diane. Okay. So we start out with statistics. So we give them our domestic violence impact fact sheet, and I have them looked at over, and we start the discussion when they identify something that might stand out for them. And one of the things that traditionally comes up is the number of men that are impacted by domestic violence. So that's one of the starting points for our discussion. Or when they realize that domestic violence is more than just physical violence. Some of them have not even considered that financial violence is considered part of the domestic violence pattern. Many times they're taken aback by the number of domestic violence-related deaths that we have in the state. They really weren't aware of that. Or they'll comment on the vulnerability of Native people, especially Native women. So we give them that impact sheet and we start the discussion there. I always ask them at the beginning of the training, what they think is important for them to know about domestic violence and the work that they do. And they generally come up with some really good responses regarding understanding the dynamics, the non-physical control dynamics of domestic violence. They always want to know about the impact on children. They want to know what resources are. They want to know how to do their job better. So that's always heartening. We always start off on a really positive note in those trainings. So we give them the definition of domestic violence to make sure they understand that. Then we let them know what the statute is, the legal definition of domestic violence, that it's not a domestic violence law that we have, but it's a two-part statute that addresses domestic violence. We give them the cool handout that Mary put together while she was here that has all of the crimes listed, and then on the back of that handout it has the relationship categories. So we help them understand that, and we also point out on there that our statute includes dangerous crimes against children and child and vulnerable adult abuse. So I always try to make the connection that we have that crossover. We're working with many of the same people, and it's best practice that we collaborate on those child welfare cases that have the presence of domestic violence. One of the things that I need to let you know that I do, in case you've been getting any calls from DCS, I always encourage the new caseworkers to contact the programs that are closest to them and develop a relationship with the advocates and staff in those domestic violence programs. So if you get any calls from DCS, it's my fault. I take full responsibility. But again, I really can't emphasize enough with child welfare and with us how important it is for us to collaborate. Because if we do collaborate with DCS and other systems, the only thing that it's going to do, which should be our goal anyways, is to improve the experience of domestic violence victims and their children, to improve the response and increase their safety. So we talk extensively about the legal definition of domestic violence so they understand that. We talk about the changes in the law through incidents like Katie Sudbury, and how we now cover people in dating relationships under our statute. And many of them are very interested because they have teens of their own, or they're involved in their schools and churches, and they really appreciate that contact. And then we always share information from things that have happened over the years with some of their leadership. One of their court liaisons emphasized that DCS workers need to document the coercive control, so those non-physical types of abuse and control, isolation and financial control, those kind of things, along with the physical abuse, to help them get beyond it just being about some kind of physical injury. That court liaison also said that the survivor's to-do list should never be longer than the perpetrator's to-do list. And if you've worked closely on any of these cases, you know many times the survivor's to-do list is longer than the perpetrator's list. It's a challenge to engage perpetrator parents. It's a challenge to case plan with them. It's been a lot easier over the years to focus on the victim parent because they're usually the one that will follow a case plan. They're usually the one that's more compliant, that will jump through the hoops to keep themselves and their children safe or to get their kids back if the kids have been removed. And the bottom of this next slide says that families' needs should drive the case planning or the referral. I don't know why that's not fitting on that slide, but there it is. Usually what comes up when I ask them at the beginning what they want to know about domestic violence, somebody always mentions the cycle of violence, so it behooves us to address it. We talk about the cycle of violence being present in only some cases, not all of them, so don't get hung up looking for a cycle of violence because it may not be there. We talk about how cycle of violence terminology is used, sometimes misused. We talk about it being used when we talk about generations of family. We talk about it being used when we talk about a perpetrator's relationship violence history. So we clarify that as much as we can. There's some background on that. We certainly use the power and control wheel. We also have a gender-neutral power and control wheel that we give them that would be they would be able to use if it's a male victim or if it's a same-sex relationship. We also do something fun to kind of break it up during this 3.5 hours is I've got each of those tactics on a piece of cardstock, and I split them up into groups of 4 or 5 or 6, depending on how big the class is, and have them come up with a scenario depicting this particular tactic of abuse. And that's always very interesting because people get into the role-playing. They get into the scenario or the skit that they're coming up with. They're supposed to keep it within their group. What the tactic is that they're displaying in their scenario, and the rest of the class is supposed to guess which tactic that they are displaying in their skit. One of the interesting challenges that we all up when they do that is that very rarely can they do a skit that just exemplifies one of the tactics, and it allows us to make the point that many times these tactics are interwoven or overlaid to make this whole environment of control. Rarely do you see physical violence not accompanied by verbal or emotional abuse, for instance. Same with financial control. So it's a very interesting process to have each one of the little groups do their scenario, and then for the rest of the audience to identify the tactics that they're displaying. I also am able to make the point that we all have the capacity to go there, because some of the DCS workers that are playing the role of an abuser are pretty scary and convincing. So we make the point that, you know, we all have the capacity to go there, but it's a choice. It's always a choice to use violence, and that's, I feel, an important point to make with them. So this is my trigger slide to do that exercise from the power and control wheel. We talk about physical and sexual abuse that they might see in some of the cases. We always encourage folks, if they're doing any ongoing work and in-home visits, to pay attention to any pets in the home and how they might respond to different members of the family, or if they're doing multiple visits and one visit they go and the pet's not there anymore, just asking casually about the pet. We talk about what hostage taking looks like and that it doesn't always involve chains and padlocks, but that it could be not allowing someone to leave a room or the house. We talk about sometimes the control is so deep that people's food and beverage intake is controlled or limited, or many times they're not allowed to go get medical attention if they have been injured. We talk about how families sometimes exploit each other or their children, and then we touch on sexual assault and this concept of past consent versus current consent. We talk about relationships being on a continuum, that what might be healthy for Teresa might not be healthy for me, or what might be healthy for Mary might not be healthy for Teresa, and not to impose their own beliefs and ideas about healthy relationships on the families that they are working with, that the notion of abuse is defined by the person experiencing it. We talk about that, and we encourage them to observe and ask questions to try to decide whose life is smaller. So, for instance, who has more mobility in their relationship? Who has access to resources, who has access to transportation, to a phone, and who doesn't. So whoever's life is smaller, and if there are children in that family, then that means the children's life is smaller too, that they don't have access to mobility or activities or resources like food and healthcare and those kind of things. And to come at it from that direction to try to determine who's got more power, who's got more access in that relationship. And if they're exploring a particular incident, tell me what was happening leading up to that incident. What do you think your partner's intent was when they slashed the tires on your car? What was the actual effect or impact of them slashing your tires on your car, for instance? That's always a helpful suggestion for them. Many of them identify that as being helpful. We always go to the beliefs about what causes domestic violence, and that conversation we have to address any misconceptions, stereotypes, or mythology that they might have about domestic violence. So I always ask them what causes domestic violence, and usually they'll say anger or drugs and alcohol. And then on the next slide, we start to demythify this. So the top of this slide says domestic violence is not caused by anger, substance abuse, mental illness, genetic stress, problems in the relationship. But we talk about that sometimes, especially mental illness and substance abuse, might make it worse, but it's not a root cause of it. And that you've got these words, these rationalizations directly from abusers and our colleagues that do the offender treatment program, not caused by anger or substance abuse, mental illness, genetic stress, or problems in the relationship. And we talk to each one of these if people are still struggling with it not being caused by this. We talk about it being the anger part. By a lot of perpetrators will use anger as a tool of intimidation to frighten you into compliance. But we also let them know that in their presence, DCS's presence, or law enforcement's presence, or a judge's presence, they don't act angry. They can turn that anger on and off like a light switch, and are really very charming and wonderful. And that's one of the things that I was happy to see in the practice guidelines, that it mentions that many times perpetrators are very manipulative and charming and coercive, and for them to keep an eye out for that. So we have that in-depth discussion. We talk about that we know domestic violence is a learned behavior, and then the good news is that it can be unlearned. That many times they learn it through observation, that some folks do grow up in homes where they see or experience domestic violence and think that that's a part of relationships. But also that, there are other folks that grow up in abusive homes who don't perpetuate violence in their adult relationships or in their life, or they don't find themselves with an abusive partner. We talk about domestic violence being a choice, that they have the ability to control who their victims are because they're usually not treating other people like that. And we talk about it being intentional, to gain power and control and to instill fear in their partner. Okay, so anything thus far that you need any clarification on or have any ideas about? And for those of you that have been in our trainings in the past, you're probably very familiar with this information. And it is also one of our attempts to make sure that there's consistent information out there with all responders, because one of the things we know for sure is that victims of domestic violence, their children, and even perpetrators of domestic violence aren't getting consistent responses from whoever they come in contact with in our system. We also really start to address how difficult it is for people to leave an abusive relationship. So we have them do an exercise about, identifying what's important in their life, and then getting them to a place, asking them to imagine having to leave those important things behind, which is what many victims are looking at when they make that decision to leave or end an abusive relationship. And really not to make that be the end-all, be-all, because realistically, some people are going to stay together. And if you do effective case planning with a victim parent to establish safety for the victim parent and their children, if you do effective case planning with a perpetrator to hold them accountable, recognize that abusing the other parent is a parenting choice, especially if they do it in front of the children, that couple might successfully stay together. And, it's really addressing our knee-jerk reaction, as we have in the domestic violence movement, to provide that advocacy and that support beyond leaving. So we have those kind of discussions by having them identify the most important things in their life. We make the connection to how that makes it difficult for people to leave. And we show them a video, and you might want to use this for training purposes. I'll put it in the chat box. Why we stayed. Look up that video on YouTube. It's an 8-minute video, a little bit under 8 minutes, and it's a very impactful video that has feedback from, I think, 3 or 4 different survivors on there. One of them being Mildred Mohammed, who in the early 2000s, her husband was the DC sniper, and his intent wasn't to be a sniper. His intent was to kill her because she left and took the kids to safety in DC near her sister, and he was going to punish her for leaving him and taking his kids. So we make a point, too, about how perpetrators think that they don't acknowledge their abuse, or that they should be held accountable for their abuse, and instead will spin it to, you left me for no apparent reason, and you in the court took my kids from me, so therefore I have the right to punish you. So we have that whole discussion when we talk about leaving, and that we're asking the wrong question. Why is this person abusing and still getting away with it? Right? Why aren't we focusing on the person that is making this environment unsafe? And I say that, ad nauseum throughout the training, to encourage that focus on the person putting the children in danger. So we talk about, too, about if people do leave, many times there's not any place to go. And I know especially since a lot of funding has gone towards community-based services and towards mobile advocacy, there's not going to be as much shelter space. And, realistically, not everybody needs shelter. About 25 to 30% of victims need shelter. The others need a variety of different kinds of support. And so to develop services that will better meet the needs of the bulk of domestic violence victims is where we're shifting to. So we talk about the unmet requests for help, shelter, counseling, and services. About as many, it mirrors about as many babies as are born in the United States. Each day, it's just a very interesting conversation that usually comes out of that. We certainly talk about leaving being the most dangerous time, and that, when anybody pushes a domestic violence victim to leave before they've got a plan and resources and safety in place, we might make them more vulnerable. We make a connection with the domestic violence-related deaths we have in the state, and that most of them, or the greater percentage of them, happened when somebody was trying to leave or just ended the relationship. We would make that connection with them and really encourage them to focus more on accessing resources and increasing safety for the victim parent's case plan. And I've seen the case plans, and like I said earlier, many of the less enlightened caseworkers will do like a cookie cutter case plan for each parent, which isn't effective at all. They should be individualized, again, for the victim parent, looking at increasing their safety and their protective capacities for their children and accessing the resources that they need, and for the perpetrator parent being a nonviolent, nurturing parent who's taking responsibility for their choices and working to change that. Okay. So we have an in-depth discussion on the barriers for people leaving, and we're always adding to this. There was one more that we wanted to add. But we talk about how difficult it is to leave, and especially when you're facing all of these barriers. Again, where am I going to go? Do I have enough money, or am I making enough money to provide a roof over my head and the things that my children will need? We talk about the challenges in rural areas. We talk about the challenges with some of our undocumented victims and families. We talk about the challenges sometimes on who their partner is. You know, if their partner's an upstanding member of society or law enforcement. We talk about social norms in their community and their culture. And then many times just a general lack of resources or lack of access to those resources. We always encourage them to, like I said, connect with the local programs. They have to do their safety assessment to be sure, but they don't have to do the in-depth safety planning on their own. They can do that collaboratively with a domestic violence advocate or domestic violence program staff. So we encourage them to look to the professionals, you guys who do this work every day, to work with them on those cases. So again, I know that the domestic violence movement has had its struggles with the child welfare system, but in the best interest of the people that we serve, I would encourage you to be as collaborative as possible while still maintaining the confidentiality and support for the victims that you're serving. We talk about what we know regarding children, that there's over 15 million each year that live in families where domestic violence has occurred. We know that it's a leading cause of death for pregnant women under the age of 20. In the United States, we have, this is just the murders, not the suicides, or not people that were killed trying to help, but 1,000 to 1,700 domestic violence murders annually, 1/3 of which are murder-suicides. So adding another 300 to 600 to that number is what happens in the United States each year. And that 30 to 50% of kids witness the murder of a parent by the other, or murder-suicide, which might include one of their siblings. We, too, try to make the point about kids in their most vulnerable developmental stages witnessing some of this stuff. So 33% of children living at home are under the age of 2. They are in that developmental stage where they're very vulnerable. And again, to make the point of how deadly domestic violence can be, every 18 months in America we lose as many people to domestic violence as we did on 9/11, almost 3,000 people. We have been talking recently about the connection between the mass shootings and domestic violence, and that it behooves all of our systems, all of us, to take domestic violence seriously up front, on the front end, not just when it reaches a tragic point like it has recently in California and in Texas for the last couple of weeks. So we try to make that point then. So, how are we doing so far? Anything that you need clarification on? Notice a couple folks typing, but nothing is coming up that I can see. Okay, we good so far? Anybody? Yes. No? Okay. All right. Okay, Virginia says yes. Roxanne says we're okay. All right. So one of the things that we try to make clear too is that who is exposing the children to domestic violence? You guys answer that question? Who is exposing the children to domestic violence? Perpetrator, exactly, Roxanne. If you were here, I'd give you a gold star. You would be amazed how fuzzy that is for a lot of our DCS workers because they're used to putting equal responsibility on parents, which if domestic violence wasn't happening, then I could see that. It would be different, say, if both parents were alcoholics or both parents were drug abusers. But when you have domestic violence, you have one person who's the perpetrator and one person who's the victim. And again, to stay focused on the person who's making the environment unsafe, the perpetrator, is the most effective way to address this. So we know that neglect and failure to protect are used as grounds to remove children. So that's the way that we're trying to address that, is you're looking at criminal behavior here. You're looking at a situation where you've got a perpetrator of violence and you've got a victim of violence, an adult victim and their children. So we're trying to shift that approach, that perception, that read on the situation by having this discussion. We talk about the impact of domestic violence on children, what they might see with children exposed to domestic violence. So we talk about the difference between child exposure and child abuse. We also talk about the link of children experiencing or witnessing violence in the home to these other things that we're concerned about with our children. We talk about the kids don't run away for no reason. They don't start using drugs or alcohol early on for no reason, or are victims of date rape or are the rapists in teen relationships. We talk about this stuff not coming out of nowhere. And that sometimes, many times, with a lot of these issues that we're concerned about with our kids, they're directly related to what's happening in the home. So we kind of shift the perspective to take those things into consideration too. These might be the portals. If something's going on to a kid and it reaches a level to where a school counselor or a teacher or somebody else in that child's life is concerned, that might be the opening to discover, say, that domestic violence is going on at home. Find out what's going on at home is what we encourage folks. We talk about the different roles that many times kids take on in an abusive relationship, like the abuser's ally, kids that are acting out. Sometimes they are in that scapegoat role in the family to take the attention off. The victim parent, sometimes in very isolated cases where the family is cut off from any outside support or contact, sometimes the children are the victim's confidant. There's no one else to talk to, unfortunately. Sometimes we see that kids are put in caretaker positions, and they're taking care of the younger siblings. So we kind of hope that giving this information or having this discussion with DCS caseworkers will give them some different things to look for, to listen for, to ask about when they're interacting with the families. Sometimes kids will try to be the perfect child if they feel out of control or if they feel like there's something they can do to stop the violence. So this might be when children develop OCD behaviors or they're a good student or just the opposite. They're a bad student or they're always tardy or missing school. We talk about sometimes kids get hurt trying to protect the victim parent. We talk about many times that's true as kids get older, especially for boy children. So they might not be seeing a pure case of child abuse, but a child who is hurt in the process of trying to protect one parent from the other. And that's a very important distinction. It's a very important distinction to document, too, in those cases. So we have that discussion so they can do better and clearer documentation to capture what the reality is in that home. We talk about some of the coping skills that children exhibit, and these are things that they can ask the non-offending parent about, or even the offending parent if they've engaged them. If they're talking with school counselors or teachers, they can ask to see if the children exhibits any of these coping skills. They might interview other family members who has close contact with that child. So we just give them a variety of things that they can look for, that they can ferret out in these cases. We talk about the lessons that kids might learn growing up in homes where they see this happening. We talk about if they learn the lesson that violence and aggression gets you what you want, they might be using this kind of behavior at school. So our little bullies might be just aping or mimicking the behavior that they're seeing at home. So that's an important thing to follow up on. And, if we could have more conversations with our educators and school counselors and principals, I think we might be able to earlier intervene if we encourage them to explore a school bully's home life or interact with their parents or do more parental outreach. We talk about sometimes the lesson learned is that love equals abuse, or, some level of abuse is connected with this concept of love and relationships. We talk about if one parent is trying to keep the household together and survive abuse and the other parent is intent on abusing and controlling the household, sometimes kids don't get the attention they need. So that might start them in developing a belief system where they don't feel important, or they don't feel important, so it might start impacting their self-esteem. One of the other lessons learned that is very sad, and if you think about it, having feelings of fear is normal. And imagine growing up fearful every day, every moment of your life, and how that warps your world concept, your outlook on life, your level of hope, just how that can really warp a person's perception of the world. And we might see kids acting out because, if they see this stuff going on and they've got a parent that's not there for them as much as need be, they might look at adults as unsafe. So they might resist or push away or not engage with other adults in their life. So you might see that acted out in school. They might be disruptive in a classroom or disrespectful in a classroom to a teacher because they don't trust adults. So we talk about that in depth. We talk about other lessons learned that, a lot of times black and white thinking is developed, like you're either the victim or the abuser. If they see a parent using drinking as an excuse for violence, they might start to develop this as part of their belief system or their list of excuses to use. Depending on who the victim and the perpetrator is in their home, they might start to also develop this belief system that men or women are weak, vulnerable, stupid, or less than. That when you hurt others, you don't get in trouble. So if they haven't seen any accountability for that abusive parent, then they might get that injected into their belief system. And, one of those hopeless lessons that they might learn is that unhealthy relationships are to be expected. In our homes is where we start developing our concepts and our beliefs about relationships. And where it's supposed to be the most loving and nurturing, if they're not seeing that, they think this is what they've got to look forward to. And that's a pretty hopeless kind of place to be. So we talk about how coercive control, particularly isolation and not having access to resources and basic needs, how that might thwart a victim or survivor's capacity to manage day-to-day things in that relationship. We talk about how it compromises a victim or survivor's bond to their children. So obviously this PowerPoint didn't translate well, the quick meeting, so it's cutting off some stuff, and I apologize for that. And we also talk about when they are interviewing children, and a child does disclose. We talk about how important it is to acknowledge what a big deal that is. And we talk about that many times people in the family are threatened into secrecy by the perpetrator in that family. And what they choose to disclose, that's a big deal. And we've got to recognize it as such. We've got to appreciate how difficult it was to reveal that family secret. We've got to reassure them by validating their experience. And, you know, whatever they're telling us, something simple like, that sounds like it was real scary. Or how brave of you to tell me. And to follow that child's lead, if that child makes that disclosure while you're playing with Legos with them, you know, if you do any follow-up work with that child in another week or two, make sure there are Legos at that next meeting. Try to recreate that safe place that you had when that child disclosed to you. And really don't make promises or commitments you can't keep. If that child's trust has been compromised, if they might have a problem with adults, it's really important that they have people in their life that walk their talk, that their words and their actions are matching. And, you know, child welfare folks can be those people for a child. And, you know, understanding our love and loyalty to family members, we always encourage them to avoid speaking negatively about the abusive parent. You can address the behaviors that, you know, it sounds like when that happened, it was real scary. But regardless of what they've gone through, they're still going to love that parent. And we don't want to challenge their loyalties or confuse them more about what they're feeling. We also encourage them to not always follow along word for word the assessments and the forms that they have to fill out on parents, but, you know, to make sure that you ask every family you work with about the presence of violence or coercive control. And, you know, along the way, I already told you we're giving out that impact sheet on domestic violence. We're giving out a couple different power and control wheels. We're giving out a shelter list along with shoe cards and the hotline brochures. We always encourage folks to put together a domestic violence folder that they have with them so that when they're interviewing parents, they can bring out any of those handouts that would be relevant to move the conversation or the interview along. So we encourage them to ask simple, concrete questions. Make sure you break down your questions so that it's digestible for people, that you don't use big words or confusing concepts. Ask about the relationship, how it functions. What happens when you guys disagree? What happens when there's an important decision to be made? And just asking general questions like that, sometimes that'll start giving the DCS worker some insight into what the dynamics in the family are about. Ask if they feel safe in their home. Ask if they feel safe with their partner. So and we encourage them not to ask, are you a victim of domestic violence? We ask them to ask these general questions and kind of peel back the layers of what's going on in that relationship. We encourage them to use supportive interventions. So we give them ideas on what to ask and what to say, such as validating victims' experiences, certainly building on their strengths, which, you know, child welfare uses strength-based approaches. So to do that with each member of the family, particularly victims. it's important that we're a part of helping them regain control over their life, to explore their different options. And we talk about it's not an option to tell them, get an order of protection or we're going to take your kids. That's not an option. And as a matter of fact, we know that it sets many victims up for failure. We know that if they're honest with the judge when they go in to get an order of protection and the judge asks them why they want this order of protection, and they tell the judge, well, my DCS caseworker told me to get an order of protection or they're going to take the kids, that is not grounds for a judge to issue an order of protection. So therefore, they're not going to issue the order of protection. With DCS, it looks like the victim is not following their case plan or making attempts to keep their kids safe. So it doesn't end well for the victim, but it was a set up for failure from the beginning. So we have an in-depth discussion about what orders of protection are, what they aren't, that to offer orders of protection is an option. Orders of protection will work for some victims and not for others. And to really help them change the way that they're using orders of protection as part of case planning. We also kind of hint around that, doing that, get an order of protection or we'll take your kids is kind of an 80s response. So we kind of encourage them to update their response. And this, again, these practice guidelines, they were just put out in April of this year. They really have some great suggestions for the DCS caseworkers. And we're going to use this in our trainings and go over this and work with them to incorporate these guidelines into their daily practice. Got to find out first if that's being mentioned or if they are getting separate training on that, but if they're not, we're going to make sure that gets done. All right. So we talk about things that you can say. Many of you have heard these ad nauseum over the years, but they're simple, supportive things that you can say, concern for your safety and the safety of your kids. I talk to them, too, about how they present themselves and how they can better use the power of their position and the power of their agency. That we're here to help. We're concerned about the kids. We want to help you make sure your kids and yourself are safe. We can offer X, Y, and Z resources. The last thing we want to do is separate your kids from you. Be realistic about when they have to step in and what guidelines they have to follow for child safety. But just to offer them themselves as a resource, to offer them as a partner in keeping themselves and their children safe. And, we just talk about how, give them some suggestions on how they can improve their approach. We're also talking with them about some concepts from the Safe and Together program. The principles of that program are that it's in the best interest of the children to keep them safe and together with a non-offending parent, and how important it is to partner with a non-offending parent as a way to promote safety, permanency, and well-being for the children. And I know that a lot of you guys that have done domestic violence work over the years, you've seen the trauma that happens to kids and victim parents when they're separated, and the long road that it takes for them to reunite with their children. And many times there's not been any engagement with the perpetrator parent, and they just move on to the next relationship and do the same thing with the next partner. So that's what this approach is trying to address, is that shift in approaches where child welfare actively works to improve outcomes by engaging and intervening with the perpetrator parents. And that hasn't been done very much at all. Talks about the critical components is that we document and we ask about that pattern of coercive control, that we look at and document the actions taken by a perpetrator to harm the child or children, that we look at the full spectrum of the non-offending parents' efforts to promote the safety and well-being of the children. And that's one of the things, again, that is addressed in this document. To look at adult victims' protective capacity to provide safety and stability for their children, and to really make sure that that's well documented. To look at the adverse impact of the perpetrator's behaviors on the children and to document that. To understand the role of substance abuse, mental health, socioeconomic and cultural issues in domestic violence cases. So that's been a very exciting discussion to have with them, to see the light bulbs go off when we talk about these new approaches and these new ways to work with families. We talk about some of the skills that's important for caseworkers to have when partnering with survivors. I'm glad you made it, Memory. The ability to introduce DCF concerns in a non-blaming way, to assess and listen for strengths as they relate to day-to-day safety, validate survivor strengths, collaboratively develop a safety plan with them. That collaboration doesn't only mean with the victim parent, but it also means with services like your own program. So again, when they come calling to find out about your program or to meet you or develop a relationship, don't put them off. Work to actively collaborate with DCS. Again, letting them know first and foremost that your job is to keep victims safe and confidential. But if that victim feels like these people are on my team, child welfare and domestic violence, many times they're more than willing to sign a release of information so that the child welfare worker and the advocates can talk. So we encourage them to present the survivor's strengths to supervisors and or team who, and this is what we found out, they might be less than sympathetic, because one of the gaps we found is that some supervisors haven't had any recent training on domestic violence, and we are certainly offering that up to DCS and want to make that available if they think it's going to be valuable. We want to make sure that they make appropriate referrals to substance abuse, mental health, and in-home service providers, and to really focus on the domestic violence perpetrator as the source of the safety concerns. So the skills related to perpetrators, engaging perpetrators, again, same as with the victim parent, to introduce DCS concerns related to abuse in a non-judgmental and respectful way, to keep the interview focused on the perpetrator's behavior and its impact on children and the family. And for anybody that's ever worked with perpetrators, you know what a challenge that can be, because there's going to be a lot of blaming, a lot of shaming, a lot of manipulation and coercion. And if that happens when you're interviewing a perpetrator, that kind of stuff is important to document too. The ability to explore the perpetrator's own perception of the problem and its impact on self and others, and regardless of what their perception is, that's important information to document. If they don't think it's a big deal, or again, if they don't think it's a problem or they minimize it in any way, make sure that that's documented. And to develop a case plan that focuses measurable behavior change goals related to coercive control and other identified issues. So then a lot of times I go back to the power and control wheel and I re-identify coercive control as being those non-physical types of abuse. So the financial control, the isolation, the verbal and emotional abuse, the threats, etc., just to make sure that that's clear for them. And you guys know, you've been in trainings with me, anything that I think is important, I'm going to repeat many different ways throughout the training. So other skills related to perpetrators, elaborate on measurable, that they follow an order of protection and don't violate an order of protection, for instance. Or part of the case plan is if they go to offender treatment programs, if they go to those offender treatment programs the way and as often as they're supposed to. If they were supposed to move out, if they have moved out. So whatever the case plan indicates, as measurable, those kind of things. If within a month's time that they helped with the needs of the children. They didn't mess around with insurance or child support or transportation or any of those things that would be the sign of a successful co-parent. So understanding what services are appropriate or effective for domestic violence perpetrators. Not anger management, not just substance abuse, but a licensed offender treatment program. Not families counseling, not couples counseling. And they can present and document domestic violence as a factor, starting with a description of the perpetrator's behaviors. If you are using and I say this to DCS caseworkers, if you're using domestic violence as grounds for removal, for instance, then you need to be able to describe what that domestic violence is. Not just domestic violence, but exactly what are you talking about? Are you talking about isolation? Are you talking about firing a gun in the house? Are you talking about beating up the other parent in the presence of those children? Are you talking about one perpetrator, the perpetrator throwing stuff at the victim parent and almost hitting a child? It's important to be detailed about what you mean when you say domestic violence. And you can present and document that as a factor with a description of the perpetrator's behavior in detail. You make an effort to coordinate with criminal court and law enforcement when appropriate. Find out if there's an ongoing case. Find out if they're on probation for domestic violence violations. And that you can develop a plan that focuses on the perpetrator as the source of the family safety issues. We do that. We also give them all kinds of resources along with the actual handouts that we give them. And usually it's a very lively and interactive exchange with them. It's new concepts. Some of them identify it being in direct opposition to what their supervisors are telling them. But we know that there's a big shift with the Morrison Institute report and research that was done, with the connections that people are making with the mass shootings and domestic violence. We're hopeful that there's going to be some major changes in the approach and some better experiences by domestic violence victims and their children, hopefully more accountability for perpetrator parents. And I think it's important that we're open and that we're willing to be a part of that change. I want to encourage all of you to download this and have this at the ready when you are working with any folks who have an open DCS case and you might have any interaction with a DCS caseworker. But we will certainly keep you posted on any changes that are happening within the child welfare system so that you can be a part of that shift that is happening. So I think now we can open it up for any questions or comments that you might have. Karen, we're not going to send out the slides because this is the actual training that I do with the caseworkers in the new Training Institute Academy. But we did send out these practice guidelines that DCS uses, this form. We did send this out. And if any of you didn't get it, email Renee and she'll make sure that you get the practice guidelines. Yeah, Noel, really show you that why we stayed video to the rest of your staff. I think it'll be very effective for them, and especially for your newer staff that get hung up on why they stay or why they go back. I think this is a beautifully done video. Okay, anything else? Is that helpful, Heidi? Thank you. Good, Noel. Thank you, Karen. Again, when we shut this down, you'll get an automatic link to the survey. Please take the time to fill that out. If you have any further questions that come up later, email me and or Renee, and we will follow up with you. And I want to thank you all for being here, and I hope that you will be a part of us trying to make a change. I'm Virginia, and this is Carol. Okay, thanks, folks, for clarifying. If you do want a certificate for attending this training, we'll give you an hour-and-a-half certificate. And just email me and Renee, and we'll make sure that's done by the end of the year. It's not going to be immediate, because we're kind of busy for the next couple of weeks, but we will make sure that by the end of the year you'll get your certificate. I know I owe some of you a couple already, but that's on my to-do list to close out 2017. So thank you guys. Take care of yourselves, and we will talk to you soon. Renee, you want to say anything to the folks?
I would just like to say thank you for everyone that attended, and as Doreen said, we will be sending out as soon as possible certificates. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to email myself or Doreen. Thank you, and have a great day.
And have a great weekend. For those of you that don't have to work, practice some good self-care. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.